G'day everybody, I hope everyone's well. So if you follow my Instagram, you would have seen that I took on the task of doing an engine swap in a 1992 Toyota 4Runner. It was a pretty big job, a pretty big task. It was for a friend who was in a difficult situation and was probably going to have to scrap the car. But I decided to step up and help a brother out. So everything's all good and running at the moment. I just need to suss a hood scoop for him because the bonnet doesn't sit down properly. But apart from that, everything went pretty smooth. There was a few things which caught me off guard while doing the swap, which is important background information that you need to know if you're going to do this swap. And so I've decided I'm going to put together two separate videos on this whole task. So in this video, I'm going to put all of the background information and things you should know before you attempt this job. I don't want to make it sound impossible though. It's just an engine swap, but it's one or two things that you should consider before doing it. So we'll talk first about the 3VZE, which is the engine that was originally in his 4Runner. So the story goes with him, he was driving one day, I think he was sitting in traffic maybe, and the engine started overheating really bad, so he turned it off. And when he tried to turn it back on, it would just crank and it wouldn't start. And so he had it towed to RHD, which is the Australian Roadside Assistance Group. And they said that he'd done his head gaskets, which is pretty fair enough. The 3VZ's known for that. And so he got a quote from them, they tore the engine down, and then they decided that the engine was beyond repair. It needed machining on all the bores and a whole bunch of work, and they gave a quote of $14,000 to get it fixed. So $14,000 is really, really expensive, and I was able to do this job with parts alone for just about $4,500, which is a fair save on the 14 grand quote which they originally gave. So we'll talk briefly about the engine that was in the 4Runner, the 3VZE. I don't want to say it's a great motor. It's a good motor, but there's certain design choices made by the engineers at Toyota that have compromised its reliability. So the problem these 3VZs have is to do with the way their exhausts are routed. So because it's a V6 motor, it has an exhaust manifold on either side of the V. These manifolds are merged together by what's called a crossover pipe, which joins the right bank or the driver's side bank of cylinders across to the passenger side and merges them down to the whole exhaust system which runs under the car. Now that's all well and good, but strangely what Toyota decided to do is have the actual dump from the whole exhaust manifold system down to the main exhaust out from about cylinder 2 or the middle of one of the exhaust manifolds. So what this means is that the exhaust coming from the driver's side bank has to effectively backflow through the pressure from the exhaust pulses to get down and out through the exhaust system. And what this causes is a hot spot on cylinder 5, and this in turn can cause head gasket failure because the oversaturation of heat is bad. It will warp the head and it could do damage to the block and the bore. This isn't entirely the engine's fault or Toyota's fault for that matter. This is a legacy design which was introduced in 1988. So this was before most of the amazing engines started to come out of Toyota, which Yamaha assisted development with. And so because of these factors, you've got effectively a ticking time bomb in your engine bay, providing that you still have the original exhaust system set up. There's a couple of mods you can do, which would probably be a bigger radiator, a what's called crossover pipe delete, where you run an individual exhaust down from the driver's side bank and merge it under the car. So you can go to that extent and do those reliability modifications, but at the same time, it's an old design, it's single overhead cam, it's really early iteration of electronic fuel injection with a mechanical distributor on it. So it's overall just a relatively underpowered motor in relation to what you could have in your car. But enough said about the 3VZ, we're going to talk about the 5VZ now and the reason why it's good to swap in. So the 5VZ is an exceptional motor. It's amazing. The reason for that is that it's a newer design by Toyota. It's incorporated a lot of the design features that they observed when Yamaha assisted development in engines such as the 4AGE and the 2JZ. So if you're looking down at the basics of the motor in comparison to the 3VZ, the biggest change that it has is double overhead cams and 24 valves. So what that means is that there is 4 valves per cylinder, allowing more airflow through the cylinder or less restricted airflow. And because this engine is naturally aspirated, that frees up breathing and allows the engine to rev much easier without restriction. As well as this, one of the big features of it is the fact that it's a non-interference engine. So what this means is that the rotating assembly in the engine block, i.e. the pistons, never come within the operating area of the valves. So this means that in an awful scenario that your timing belt breaks, there is no chance that you're gonna have pistons kiss valves and bend things and break things and cause thousands of dollars of repair work. As well as this, it's a much later motor. It has a much more modern and extensively developed electronic fuel injection system with coils instead of a distributor, meaning that there is more controllability for the engine, for the spark event, and all of the engine running parameters. All of these factors mean that the engine does develop more power and more torque than the 3VZ, at the cost of maybe using a bit more fuel and just being a bit heavier. So, we've spoken a bit about the background. We're going to get into the nitty gritty now, and we're going to speak about the parts you'll need. So, the first big thing that we need to take into consideration before starting or attempting a job like this is the time constraint. So, the standard, or what I've read around and from my own experience doing this job, you've got to be ready to put aside more than 100 hours, maybe even up to 150, 200 hours. So the reason I say this is because this job can take a different person much longer than one person. I am lucky because I've got a lot of the tools and a lot of the setup already in place. I didn't have to go out and buy a lot of stuff. If you're just sort of an auto hobbyist and you're going to have a go at this job, feel free. It's an awesome job, it's awesome fun, and you learn a lot. However, you do have to consider the time constraint. The reason it takes so long, or the reason it took me quite a while, is because if you're only able to work on the car after work, for instance, you've got 2 hours like one night here and there. Usually the first hour that you actually start working, it's downtime, you're setting up, you're getting the tools together, you're assessing what needs to be done, and it ends up actually having a knock-on effect and taking quite a lot longer than the actual time you've put into it. It's a much better idea to be able to maybe even take a holiday from work, take a week or a couple of days off and try and absolutely smash it out, because if you can set aside quite a few hours and work for this extended amount of time, you'll get much more done than if you were working along that same amount of hours but split across quite a few days. Right, so the first thing you're going to need is a 5VZFE. So the 5VZFE here in Australia is found in the Toyota Prado most predominantly. These are a very common car, and people love them, so people bought a lot of them, and they're relatively cheap to be found in auto wreckers. All of the parts that I paid for, I'll talk about them all in detail, but all the parts together was $3,500 from an auto wrecker. Now this might sound like a lot of money, but that's just Australian auto wreckers in general. I was speaking to a bloke that wrecks them privately out of his own yard, and he was surprised that I was able to actually get my hands on an engine. He was saying that the auto wrecking yards, they'll actually wait until they've got about 8 or 10 Toyota Prados, wrecking ones, and they'll pack them all into a container and ship them off to Saudi Arabia, because there is quite a necessity for them over there. A lot of people want them there. I'm not sure why. So you'll have to be prepared to spend a bit of money to get the engine, unless you've found a donor car. Some of them can go pretty cheap on Marketplace, but because they're not really a car that's followed by people in the auto hobby, in the mechanic hobby, they tend to be owned by like families and all of that. When they go wrong, these families will tend to just sell them to the Cash for Cars people rather than actually wrecking them themselves on Marketplace. So, first item we need is the 5VZFE itself. It's really good to try and get everything from one car. So what I got was the 5VZ itself, including the alternator and the aircon compressor. You can't use the aircon compressor from the 3VZ. However, I believe the alternator from the 3VZ can work. It was just easier for me to use the 5VZ's alternator. What I highly recommend you do, and in fact what I'm going to go ahead and say now that you need to do, is find an engine with the wiring loom attached to it. This is going to make things a whole lot easier than if you had to put together your own loom and connect up all of your own sensors, because that would be an absolute nightmare. It would be doable, but it would be a nightmare. You'll also need the MAF sensor. This is the important component. So the MAF sensor you can probably actually get separately to the engine and that, if you can find a cheaper one. They seem to be just a generic part. They've got their own part number. What you may or may not need is the charcoal canister. This item is good to have. This is a legal requirement in Australia. I think it's post 1997. This is just an item to sort of alleviate some of the emissions from petrol vehicles. So the evap canister or the charcoal canister, you can get by without using it. What a lot of people do is they'll just run the vent from the fuel tank into the chassis rail. The whole idea of the evap canister is to take the evaporated gasoline and just inject it into the intake so that it doesn't vent to atmosphere and cause damage to the planet. So now we're going to talk about the ECU. So this is where things get a bit more complicated, because the 5VZFE, or the Australian one at least, it differs between years, as there was a change in the ECU itself. There's a different part number and a different pinout on the later ones. If you are finding yourself a separate ECU to the engine and wiring loom, you've got to make sure that the ECU is compatible with the engine that's come off it, because the plugs off the wiring loom for the engine are different depending on the early or late models, so keep that in mind. So I believe the year that they changed over is between 1997 and 1998. Make sure that when you get the ECU, you are able to get the wire pigtails that come off it. So the easiest way to do it would be to pull the motor yourself, or speak to the wrecker and get them to cut all of the plugs that plug into the back of the ECU, except the ones that go to the wiring loom for the engine, otherwise that would be a massive problem. But all of the body harness connectors, just get them to cut the pigtails off so that you're able to utilize them when you wire it up. I myself used a pre-1998 motor, so it had the early version of the ECU. You are more than able to get by with the late version of the ECU. And the only thing here is that there's going to be a little bit of a difference between the immobilizer system. So the 5VZ seems to be the first generation of engines in which Toyota incorporated their own immobilizer into the ECU. So all the immobilizer does is, as its name suggests, it immobilizes the car and stops it from being stolen or moved. All of the other cars that I've worked on, my Toyota Hilux and my Nissan Patrol, the immobilizer is isolated from the ECU. It acts as an ignition interlock so that there is no way for 12 volt to get to the starter solenoid and start the engine. However, if you were to bypass the starter, providing that there was power to the ECU, the engine would start and you'd be able to effectively steal the car. So Toyota changed the way they designed their ECUs, and from the 5VZ, even from the early version, they've incorporated an integral immobilizer into the ECU. So the first item of the immobilizer system is the key itself. So these keys, they contain a little transponder chip inside them, and this chip is read by the next item, the key reader ring. So this key reader ring is energized by the key reader amplifier, and then this is then transponded either to the ECU if you have a late ECU, or if you have the early version, you'll need to also get the immobilizer box. The gist of how this system works is that the chip and the key, it's energized by the key reader ring once power is given to it. It gives off a signal which is then read by the key reader amplifier. This signal is then directed to the immobilizer box or the ECU, depending on what year your system is. This box will then identify the signal, and it will then transmit a frequency along two wires to the ECU itself. This frequency is then read by the ECU, and then the ECU determines whether this signal is right and will allow the engine to start and perform normally. If you do not hook this system up correctly, you can get pranked a bit, because from what I've heard, the engine will start and run for about 10 seconds and then stop. So believe it or not, those are all of the physical parts that you're going to need for this swap. All of the other parts, such as engine mounts and the flywheel and clutch, you can actually scavenge from the 3VZ. So you have the choice of either using the 5VZ or the 3VZ flywheel. It may be a good idea to use the 5VZ flywheel since it's slightly heavier. However, the 3VZ one will work fine, and you'll be able to use a 3VZ clutch and have everything from the flywheel back just standard to the 4Runner. The nice thing about the 5VZ being the same family as the 3VZ is the bell housing pattern is exactly the same for both the manual and the automatic transmissions as with the engine mounts. If you can only find an automatic donor engine for a 5VZ, that's completely fine. The 5VZ that I used was an automatic one originally. The only difficulty you may face is trying to trick the ECU into thinking there is an automatic transmission there so that there are no check engine lights. Or you can do the extra sneaky one where you just don't even hook up the check engine light. So that about wraps this video up. This video was just the background information and a bit of talk as to what you'll need to know before you start buying parts and all of the stuff. I'm going to have another video coming out in the near future with all of the footage that I filmed and the way in which I swapped the 5VZ in. I may even do a second follow-up video which simplifies everything and has visually drawn wiring diagrams so that everyone is easily able to understand how I did the swap. But anyway, I think that ties off all of the loose ends that I needed in this video. So thanks everyone for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. Make sure you like and subscribe if you like what you see here. And I'll have another video coming out in the very near future with the second part of this swap. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll catch you all later.